Hey guys, what's up? So I'm gonna go over hips today. We are gonna talk all about hips. So a lot of times during practice, I'm always saying, do this with your hips, do this with your hips, do that with your hips. I'm always talking, hips is like a huge cue that I use during practices. And all my athletes are like, man, these hips must be really important. And I'm sure a lot of athletes like you have these kind of same thoughts and questions that go through your practice if your coach is always constantly talking about your hips. So we're gonna dive into the importance of hip mobility and using your hips throughout your programming and your training. So for those that don't know me, my name's Fallon Headings. I'm a physical therapist and a track and field performance coach. So let's get started. So what is so important about your hips? So your hips, first of all, your glutes on the backside of that rear are the biggest muscle that you have in your body. So the biggest, largest surface area of a muscle is your glute max. So essentially, when you have a muscle that covers a huge surface area, guess what? That can be the most powerful muscle. So if you think about it, like how much strength can you get out of your finger? Like you can only push down so hard because you got these little tiny muscles in your fingers. If you think about your glutes, think of how hard you can thrust your hips forward because of how large of a muscle that is. So that's one of the reasons why it's so important to use your hips instead of trying to use just your quads and your hamstrings and other smaller muscles in your legs, because the glutes are so much more powerful. They can be so much more powerful just because it's a bigger muscle. So that's the first thing that is so important. We have two more things that we're going to go over. So the second thing is your hips can get a huge range of motion. So the more range of motion you get with your hips, the more powerful you can be. And I'm going to show this picture right behind me, is if you look at our little guy over here, his knee drive isn't getting so high. We're not really using a whole lot of hip range of motion. So here's your hips up here, and he's really not driving this hip up. So we're only using maybe about like 40 degrees of hip range of motion, and you see how much power he can produce is just this little arrow right here, okay? So then we got this guy over on the left that is using over 90 degrees of hip range of motion. So he's using probably like 100 degrees of hip range of motion. And you can see how much bigger his arrow is here. And if you have ever taken a physics class and you've learned vectors a little bit, I know I'm not going to go into that because that's not everybody's favorite topic, but he can produce a heck of a lot more force and power because he's utilizing so much more range of motion. So this is why it's so important to have good hip mobility. So it's really important to use all the hip mobility that you have because you're going to get more force. So you want to be like our runner here on the left, and here we'll put a little smiley face on him and a little frowny face on him, because we don't want to be like this guy sprinting. We want to be like our guy on the left. So that's the second thing that's really important about using your hips and having good hip mobility. The last thing that I want to talk about that's really important with the hips is using the hips is going to decrease the demands on the other smaller muscles. So if we don't have good hip mobility and we don't have good power, or we're not utilizing the power through our hips, the next muscles that our body's going to look to use is our quads and our hamstrings down here, and our back up here. So our back muscles and our quads and our hamstrings are a lot smaller than our hip muscles. And if we continuously use those smaller muscles, that's when we get those aches and pains in our back, in our quads, in our hamstrings, because you're utilizing and loading those smaller muscles too much, and the load is just too much for your body to handle. So essentially, if you have good hip mobility and you utilize your hips really well during your during your training program, you will be less likely to injure and have aches and pains due to a loading process, due to a loading restriction with your quads, hamstrings, and back. So that I think is a really key point, because so many times do I hear really sore quads, really painful hamstrings, my back's so tight, because you're utilizing and loading those areas too much, and that's why those areas are super painful and we can't get through our training programs properly. So those are our 3 big keys with hip mobility. So remember, it's our biggest muscle, so we get our most power. We can get a lot of range of motion, which gets more power. And then we want to use that for more power so we don't overload our quads, hamstrings, and back. Okay? So if this video helped you, please share this video. Thanks for watching, and comment if you guys have any questions. Thanks, guys. Happy training.